Okay, so it's lesson 2 of enterprise computing, and we're just starting today by doing a quick rundown of what you learned last week. Most of you were here. We spent 3 hours. So what's one thing you remember from last week's class?
It uses a MVC.
All right. What else do you remember from last week?
Whenever we make changes to our HTML files, they are directly reflected, but whenever we change to other files, then we have to compile it.
You got it. So changes the C# code. We have to build or compile because those C# changes have to get added to our DLL file that lives on the server that contains all the server-side script. Okay? What else do you remember from last week?
There's a common layout file for sites.
Okay. So that makes it easy for us to theme our application. Okay, what else did we do last week? I'll save this little list on Blackboard. You'll be able to reference it during the midterm. So the more things you remember, the more notes that are here for you for your midterm. What else should we put on here? Sorry? Okay. Why does it, why is it typically more secure than PHP? You're right. Right, because our source code is compiled. The individual source files don't have to be deployed to the web server. Okay, so that's going to help protect our code. Anything else important about ASP.NET we talked about last week? Okay, can you explain a bit more, Rick? You're right.
File code, usually you're going to have the same architecture no matter what you build it.
Yep.
So you can easily build a template and then port it across. All you really have to do is products, names.
Yep. Okay. And part of the reason that it's so easily reusable we talked about how MVC allows for separation of concerns. So we have lots of files. Those files tend to be small, but most of our code is organized into very specific files. Each file has one purpose and one purpose only. So our code is very modular, which makes it easy for us to reuse things either within an application or across applications. Anything else relevant we should add to this list? Anything else remember from last week's class we should add?
Pardon me?
Anything from last week's class you remember we should add?
Oh, no, I was doing
Tack, anything we should add? All right, well, our list is a little shorter than I might like it to be. But those are at least some of the important things that we talked about last week. For those of you who weren't here last week, what we're going to build in this class, we built an application last week, and we're going to keep adding on to that same application every week. So you've got some responsibilities if you miss class. First one is you need to catch up on what we do in class. Okay. Now I record all the classes. There's a playlist for this class on YouTube. The link is on Blackboard to it. So I will always record our lessons. So if you're not here, and they're live streamed in real time, so if you're not here, you have a week to watch the lesson at home, catch up and do the work. All the code we do will also be on GitHub at the end of every lesson. Okay. But everything we do builds on the previous class. So if you weren't here last week and you haven't caught up, you'll need to today, and then moving forward, you miss any classes, you'll get the code off GitHub, get the YouTube video, watch the video. Yep.
Where's the link for the video?
Okay. So the link inside pretty much everything I put up for you here is in tools and resources. So the first two links are the ones you need. So I've created a separate playlist. So all my courses, each one every semester is in its own playlist. Okay, so I've got a winter 2018 for COMP2007. I only recorded the second half of class last week. The first half we were just kind of chatting. So I didn't record the first half. Okay, but once we actually started building stuff, it's on here. And here's the link to my GitHub, my main GitHub page. And if you just click on repositories, all the code we do will be in that PM. So there's two sections of the class. I do the same lesson both Friday morning and Friday afternoon. Also, if you ever need to miss class on a Friday afternoon because you have a co-op interview, something going on, the Friday morning class is at 8 a.m., same room. So it's fine if you want to come Friday morning. That's fine. Actually, for those of you who weren't here last week, you probably know who I am. My name's Rich, but maybe you can tell me your names.
Yeah,
Roman?
Keon.
Keon. Okay, welcome to class. Everybody else was here last week? Arjib? Navneet. Welcome, guys. So last week's code is here on GitHub, which you can take and download. We didn't do an awful lot. We just basically set a project up, and you can catch up from the video lesson.
Is there a way to change your authentication after you build the project, or is it easier?
It's much easier to create a new one. You can, but there are so many packages and files involved in the authentication, it's best to let Visual Studio set it up. Okay, so what we're going to do, we're not going to actually use our database today, but I want to get the database actually set up. We'll use it in a couple of weeks, but we'll download it, we'll configure it today so we can start to use it when we start talking about models. So we have two options for running the database. One option is we can install, if you download, I put up this link last week, I'll just jump over to the page here. If you want to run the database locally in class, then you want to download and install SQL Server Express. If you don't want to install this on your machine, that's fine. We can also just create our database on your Windows Azure hosting account, which all of you should have access to. So I'm going to show you both ways. I've already set, so if you don't have SQL Server installed on your machine, you can go ahead and download it now, but it's going to take a while to do. The other program that you want that will also be on here on this page is this first one, this SQL Server Management Studio. Now, everybody needs this program, whether you're installing a local database server or not. This is basically Microsoft's version of my SQL Workbench. It allows us to connect to any SQL Server database that we have been granted access to. It's much better than Workbench. It has a lot more features. It's a lot more powerful. It's free. So at minimum, you'll want to install this. So this allows you to connect both to a local as well as to a remote database. So I'm going to connect first to my local SQL server. Some of you may have installed SQL Server last week. So if you did and you want to run it locally, I'll show you how we can create a database there. So I'm going to go into my weekly learning folder and into week 2. And I have an SQL script here that we're all going to need. Whether you're building the database locally or on Azure, doesn't matter. We're all going to need a copy of the database someplace. So if you just want to download this file, it says Music Store SQL script. Just right click it, save it. So I'm going to go into the folder I made last week where we have our Music Store project. Excuse me. If you weren't here, you can just go to my GitHub repository. You can just download that COMP2007 PM. You click on the green, just click clone or download and choose download zip. You get a copy of it. Just extract it to a folder, and then you've got a working copy where my project left off last week. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go to that folder in Windows. And when I go inside the project folder, this is what it looks like. So we've got my git ignore file here so that all these 100 megs worth of support packages don't have to get copied up to GitHub. I have a project for my unit tests. We have a project that contains our web application. And then we have this .sln file, which is the solution. That's the file we open that opens up the entire thing in Visual Studio. I'm going to create another folder here. In most of my applications, usually we have a bunch of documents, either they're client documents, maybe we store credentials, things like that, image files we're working with. So I like to create a folder that I call docs. Now, I don't upload this folder to the server. I just keep this on my computer, but any documents related to the project, I keep in there. So I'm just going to save this SQL script into that folder. I'll right click it. Choose my save as. And I'll just save this file into my docs folder. So now I've got this SQL file here. So now I'm going to run this script file with my local database server, and I'll get a local instance of this database. Again, if you don't have the local database server running, not a big deal. Here's how to do it. And if you're still installing, if you want to run locally, but you're not set up for today, I'm recording this so you can always go and do this after class once, or even later in the class once you have SQL Server installed in Management Studio. So I'm going to open up Management Studio. Does anybody actually have a local instance running already? Or nobody does yet? Okay, that's fine. I'll show you the process. It's fine if you just want to run it all on Azure. That's fine as well. So you get this window popping up, and to connect to your local server, you just click the drop down, and these are all servers I've stored and connected to previously. The only option you'll see in here will say browse. So you pick browse. And if you have a local server running, it shows up here under database engine. And there's the instance of my local server. So you just select it, click OK. The authentication will default to Windows authentication, meaning we don't need a separate username and password to connect to our local server. We can just connect with our Windows credential. And that's the default when you install SQL Server Express. It just uses Windows login. So you don't even need a username and password when you're working locally. So you just click connect and you'll be connected. Now, my local one is set up with a username and password. So I need to change the authentication to the username and password I entered when I installed SQL Server. So I click connect. And then it opens this window down on the left called the Object Explorer. So it lists my server name, and if I expand databases, I get a list of any databases I've created previously on my local machine. Obviously, the first time you do this, that node is going to be empty. There won't be anything there. Creating a new database is really simple. Select the databases node, right-click, and I choose New Database, and I can give it a name. So this morning, I called it COMP2007 AM. I'll just make it COMP2000 PM. And this will create two files. The database file, and you can see the path of where it gets stored. The database file has a .mdf extension, Microsoft data format. It also creates a second file, which is a log file. That'll have an LDF extension. We don't really need to worry about those too much, so I'll just click OK, and this is going to build a blank database on my local server. So we can see it's here. If I look in the tables, there's nothing here, just some system stuff. So now I want to open up the SQL file I downloaded off of Blackboard, and I want to execute that script. It's going to build 6 tables and insert a bunch of data into them. So the way I do this is I click File, Open File, and now I'll browse to the file I just downloaded from Blackboard, which I put in my Docs folder. So I open this up. And it's going to create some tables, build some relationships and some constraints, and it's going to insert data into most but not all of the tables. So all I need to do to run my script here is click the execute button. I'm going to do this process again in a minute, but with the database on Azure. So I'll run the script. It runs really fast on my local server. It's already done. Now, notice my tables don't show up. There's still nothing here. I just need to click this refresh button. And now you can see I've got 6 tables built here. And if I want to query any of these, I could just right-click one of them. So they show me the 1,000 records, and we can see what our table looks like. So we've got our columns, and we can see our data. So this is fairly similar to the query editor you would have used in your relational database course when you work with MySQL. Who is your teacher for that? Ed Andrew. Okay, so she would have used MySQL Workbench. So Management Studio is similar. It has a lot of additional features that MySQL Workbench doesn't necessarily have. We won't use a lot of them, but it has some neat tools. I'll just show you a couple of them. One of them is this. When I go to run a query, I can turn this little button on. It says include actual execution plan. Excuse me. Here's what that does. So right now I run a query and I have 2 little tabs at the bottom. The first one gives me the results of the query. The second one just gives me a message telling me how many rows my query fetched. That's good. But if I want to optimize my query for performance, I can turn this little window on, run my query again. I still get the results and any messages, but now I also get this little tab that says execution plan. Anybody have an idea what that information is showing us at the bottom? Get a little graphic here. What would the point of this be?
The visual representation of the actual text above it, like first with the select statement.
Yep, so that's part of it, but it also has this. It's got this cost with a number here. What do you suppose that cost is telling us? And you can see the details here if I mouse over it. Who cares about this stuff? What does that information mean?
How much processing power it takes.
Absolutely. So it's telling us, it's breaking down. If we write a complex query with, or we'll write one, I'll write one with a, let's say we'll type, we'll run, let's say title, price, I'll do a join here. Let's say I'm going to write a query to show both the album names, the price, as well as the artist name. The execution plan tells me when I write this query which parts of my SQL are using the most resources. So maybe this is a really complicated query and it is used to populate data on a web page in our application. And the people using it, we keep complaining that that page is too slow. It takes too long for me to get results on this page. Well, we can run the query here, turn on the execution plan, and we can see if there's some way we can performance tune it. Is there a way we can make this query more efficient so that our users who are using the application that are calling this query aren't waiting so long? So it gives us these kinds of tools. So for example, doing the sorting, well, that is 32% of the time involved here. 32% of the resources necessary to run this query. So do we really need sorting, or do we really need to sort by both of those columns? Is there a more efficient way we could do this? So that's one thing we can do. Excuse me, can you close the door, please, as you found it? Thank you. A couple of the other neat features within Management Studio. If we want to modify a table, we could write an alter table command, just like we're used to, you learn to do. But we also have a visual table designer. This also saves time in building a database. If we want to build a new table, if I choose a table and click design, if I want to add columns, I can just type. Allow nulls. Well, I don't have to do these things by creating an SQL command. I can just click and type in here. It saves time. To set a field as the primary key or remove the primary key, I can just right-click, remove or insert primary keys. Most of the SQL commands we're going to use are going to be the same as what you've already learned. There are a few things that are different. For example, there's no auto-increment keyword in SQL Server. The equivalent is this. Notice I click here on the ID primary key field. Down here, there's a property that says identity specification that's set to yes. So the auto-increment feature in SQL Server, the equivalent is called identity rather than auto-increment. We also saw when I ran my first query, I could do it this way. This is also different, right? We don't see this in MySQL. If we want to only get a certain number of records back, in SQL Server, we ask for the top 1,000. How would we do this in a MySQL database? Yeah, we would use limit. And where does that limit keyword go in the query? Yeah, it actually goes at the end. So if this was a MySQL query, we'd have limit 1,000 here. So most of our commands and keywords are the same. There are a few differences between SQL Server and MySQL. These are probably the two most common differences we'll see. Auto increment and limit in MySQL, identity and top in SQL Server. Most of the other things you're used to, they're all going to be transferable from one to the other. One of the other great features in SQL Server is the ability to create and store views. This saves us lots of time if we want to run complex queries. So let's say I need to run a query, I want to write a query, then that query is going to use 3 or 4 tables and select different fields and have some sorting. I could still write the query here, kind of as I started to do here. Or I could go into this little Views tab, create a view, and this is a visual query builder. So it shows me all my tables. So maybe I want, album, artist, genre. I'll add those tables. And notice the joins are already, because the joins were created in the script we ran. We already have relationships between these tables. Let's say I want to write a album title and price. So we'll give this one an alias of artist. Genre. And I want to sort it. So here are my query results. So I haven't had to write any SQL, and I can build a complex query really quickly by using the Visual Designer. Many times also, this is really helpful. Sometimes we can save these queries and run them again. So oftentimes I'll have a customer call or email and ask me for some kind of data or report out of their database that maybe we haven't built into the application. So they'll say something like, can you show me all the new users in the last 3 months and what city they're from? Well, I can go in, quickly add in, my user table, maybe an orders table. I can quickly build a query, generate these results. And then if I want to ship those off to my customer, I can just click here, select the whole table, copy it, open up something like Excel. Maybe I can open up Excel. There it is. Oops. Paste it in, save that, here you go, here's your data. So if there's queries that our customers want us to run regularly, we can save those views in Management Studio and then just go ahead and execute or run or modify that view anytime we want. In fact, if I showed you, probably if I went into a customer directory, so all of these were all queries. At some point, this customer called and said, hey, can you run a query that gives me this data? So I just create a view, simple view without writing any code, run the query, copy and paste the results into a spreadsheet, send them their data. Now, technically, we don't absolutely need to use Management Studio. We actually can write queries and modify our database tables directly from within Visual Studio. I don't really recommend it. I'll show you how to do that. It's much slower than using Management Studio, and most of these features aren't available. So there are some developers who don't use Management Studio. They just want one program open, and they can manage the web application and manage the database all through Visual Studio. If you like that workflow, that's fine. I'll show you how to do it. I found I'm much more productive when I'm building .NET sites to use Visual Studio for the web application code, and I have Management Studio open for my database. Any day I sit down to work on an ASP.NET site, I turn on my machine, those are the first two things I open. I guess I open a browser, I open Visual Studio, I open Management Studio so I can interact with the database as I'm working. So there's my local database running. What I want to do now is go through the process of setting up a database in the Azure portal. And then we'll need to connect to it. So locally, we can create the database right through here. We don't have that ability with an Azure database. We have to create the database in the Azure portal. We have to set up a username and password. And then we have to connect to it through here. And then we can run the script to build the database tables through here. So I'm just going to close all this, and I'll kind of start all that from the beginning. So I'm going to log into my Microsoft Azure account at portal.azure.com. I'll log in with my personal Microsoft login. It's not your Georgian login. Do whatever login you've used previously to access the Azure portal. So once you're logged in, you should be here at the dashboard. So here was the database I created this morning. Sorry, the server and database. So I'll create another one now. Now you'll only need to set this database up once. We can use it each week in class, but obviously for your assignment, you're going to need to set up another database, so it'll be the same process. Like I said, I am recording it, so you can always go back and refer to the lesson 2 video when it comes time for your assignment. So we're just going to click on, actually the easiest thing, I'll click SQL databases. And I'm just going to click the add button. Now, there's one really important step when you create your database. And that is, because we're not just creating the database, we're also going to have to create a login for the database. It's vital that you put that login somewhere in a file on your computer. Because if you forget this login, you have to go to the Azure portal and reset it. So whenever you create database credentials, you should put them in a file so that you have them to reference later on. And we're going to need these credentials later on in the class. So I'm going to call my database you can either, I'm going to actually have to probably create a new resource group. The source will be blank database. And then for server, you're going to need to create a database server. So I clicked server, I click this configure require settings, and then I'm going to choose create a new server. So before we hit this button to save, this is where you want to go and make a text file. And we're going to need all 4 of these values: the database name, server name, admin login, and password. Because in order to connect to the database in Management Studio to build the tables, we'll need those credentials. And in order for our website to be able to talk to the database, we're going to need those credentials there too. So I'm going to go back to my docs folder, and I'm going to make a new text file here. Doesn't matter what you call it. I always suggest saving these credentials. So my host is going to be this. It's what I put in as the server name.database.windows.net. I'm going to save this file so anytime I need to connect, I know what my credentials are. So I'll just hit the select button, and somebody's already taken that name. Okay. If I've changed it, I better change it here. And I'll click pin to dashboard, which will put a shortcut to it on my main portal page, and just click the create button. And this will run, it'll take a minute, and it should set up a new blank database for us on the Azure portal. will take a minute or two to finish. So I will get a little notification here from this area when my database was ready. I'm just going to delete some of my databases from last semester. We only have so much room on here. Now my new one hasn't shown up yet. I may have to go through the process one more time. Oh, no, here's my server. So still working on my database. This is a bit slow. Didn't take this long this morning. I'm not sure why. Okay, it's done. It may have been slow because I'm not sure I could create another one without deleting the two that I had. We don't get an unlimited number of SQL databases. So now my database is set up. And once it's done, we should get this page. Jan, you're nodding. You got this page already? Okay, good. Now, we only have one more thing we need to do, Azure Portal. And again, we only need to do it once. By default, our databases on Azure are set up so that they don't allow remote connections. Well, that's a problem. We need to connect our laptops in Management Studio to the database, and we want to connect our local ASP.NET application. So we can fix this. Once you have this screen, right here on this little white nav bar in the middle, there's a link that says Set Server Firewall. So we want to click that button. And we get this Firewall Settings window. Now, it tells us our current IP address. That's the college Wi-Fi, the college, if you're on the wireless network, that's the IP. So one easy way to deal with this is you could, although I'm not going to, you could click this button here that says Add Client IP. That will allow us to access the database whenever at the college, which would work for now. The problem is, as soon as you went home, if you want to do anything else with this, you're going to get remote connections not allowed if your IP is anything other than the college IP. So what we want to do is we want to create a firewall rule that allows all IP addresses in. So if we're here, we're at the library, we're at our favorite coffee shop, we're at a friend's house, we're home, anywhere, doesn't matter. As long as we have the right username and password, we can get in. So in the here, down here under this heading, it says rule name, start IP, end IP. We've got 3 text boxes. So we'll create a global firewall rule. We'll just call it all. Just give it a name. And we're going to allow all IPs in. So starting from 0.0.0.0 and ending where? Nope. What's the highest possible IP if the lowest is 0.0.0.0? You got it, Rick. 255, 255, 255, 255. This means basically anybody with an IP, a version 4 IP address, as long as they have the login, we can take our machine anywhere and we can get in. So then you just click the save button up here on the nav bar. Doesn't take long. Notification tells us our firewall has been updated. So now we should be able to access the database from Management Studio or Visual Studio. So I don't really need to do anything else in the Azure portal. I can leave it open, but we're basically done. The database is created, but it's empty. So what we want to do now is use Management Studio to try to connect to it, and we want to run the script to create the tables and put the data in. So if you've installed Management Studio on your machine, hopefully you were able to install that tool. It's not that big. You should have been able to install it by now. I see a few nods, so that's good. So open up Management Studio. If you're on Windows 10, my suggestion is pin it to your start menu because we're going to use it. We're going to use Management Studio a lot. Same with Visual Studio, right? Don't go searching for them every week. Save yourself some time. I actually put Visual Studio right down in my taskbar because there's never a day that I don't open my laptop that I don't open Visual Studio. So then we get this screen, this connect to server screen. I'm actually just going to close this window. We're going to connect to our server, but we're going to do it in the window up on the top left, and that'll allow us to save those credentials permanently. So I'm going to hit cancel here. You should have this little window that says registered servers. If you don't see it, Chaston, you're shaking your head, just click on view. It's the fourth item in the view menu. Click registered servers. It'll open up that little window for you. So basically, the registered servers is a list of any servers that you have databases on, so you can save those credentials so you don't have to enter them every time. You just click on one and you're connected. This Object Explorer, this shows you any servers we're connected to currently that we're actively working with in this session. So if you expand Database Engine, you probably get this. You get a little folder that says local server groups, and you might get central management servers. If you expand local server groups, you guys aren't going to have anything in there. But here's the way I use it. All of these, so here's my local server, my computer name. All of these are different hosting companies that I have databases on. So all of my Azure databases, I've created an Azure group. I just right-clicked and chose new group. You don't need to do that. We're only working with Azure. You're not working with different hosts, so you don't need to do it. So for example, with this host, I have 3 clients whose web applications are hosted there. So I created a group for New Tech, which is a hosting company based in the US. And I have 3 clients, so I've registered each database separately. And all those credentials are stored. So if I want to work with one of those databases, I can just double click it and it connects me. I don't have to enter my username and password. They're already stored. So what you can do, if you just right click local server group, pick new server registration. Rather than doing it right in the root, I'm going to do it inside of my Azure subfolder because I want all my Azure servers inside of that little folder called Azure. You don't need that folder. So you do it by right clicking local server group and choose new server registration. I'll do it by clicking my Azure node and picking new server registration. So now we get this little credentials window. I don't know why they made it so small. So this is where we need the credentials we just created in the Azure portal, and hopefully you put them in a text file so we can just copy and paste them. So here's our server name, whatever the server name you created is. database.windows.net. So that goes in here, just paste it. Our authentication type needs to be changed. We're not using Windows authentication now. We're connecting to a remote server, so we have to put in a username and password. So change this drop down from Windows authentication to SQL Server. And now you need to enter the username and password you just created when you set up your database. So I will just grab
The reason why you don't use Databricks.
Pardon?
The reason why you don't use Databricks for this instead of MySQL Workbench.
Well, we're not using MySQL Workbench. We're using SQL Management Studio.
Oh, again, they're going Databricks over.
This is the standard interface for working with SQL Server databases, right? So any feature, anything you could possibly want to do with a SQL Server database is built in here. To be honest with you, I'm not even sure. I'm not even familiar with the other tool you're mentioning.
Databricks is another thing created by JetBrains, including PHP Storm. Very versatile. If you work across multiple database structures, you can import pretty much anything. It's the third one.
Let's have a look.
Figure in for any type of SQL language like so.
I have never seen or used it. So yes, you could use it. But typically my preference, I'm working in the Microsoft world, I'm going to use their tools, right? It's their database, I'm going to use their software. There's no reason, I don't see any reason why you couldn't use this if you wanted to.
I just know you can use JetBrains software.
No. Yeah, generally I do, not in this class I don't. But thanks for that. It's useful. So you can also put in a friendly name if you want. If not, the registered server name just defaults to the actual host. I'll put it in as I'll just call it COMP2007 EM. I don't even need to specify the database name. The server's smart enough to know this credential only has access to that one database. So it'll automatically connect me to the database we just created. So we can test this. And if my credential is right, it'll tell me the test succeeded. And if it does, we can just click save. And it will add my database over here as a registered server. So to connect to it, all I need to do now is double click it. I don't have to provide the credential again because I checked off save the password. So this is not that different than the connection manager in my SQL Workbench that allows you to create a connection and save it permanently. So all I have to do is just double click it. It's going to try to connect to Azure. And if it does, the Azure server will show up in Object Explorer down at the bottom. Notice it's not nearly as fast as connecting to my local database. My local one connects pretty much right away. There is a bit of lag time. So now I can open it up. And here's my music store PM, my afternoon database. I can expand it. And there's nothing here, just a folder that says system tables, but we have no tables in here yet. So if I was going to come in here, say next week to work with the database, I'll just close out of this. Our setup is done. So anytime I want to access the database, I can fire up Management Studio. I'll close that initial pop-up window, and then I can just double click. So I'll just get rid of that, go over here, double click it, and I'm connected. So here's my database. So I now need to do the same process of running the script that you saw me do once before with my local server. We grab that SQL script out of the week 2 folder on Blackboard. We now want to open it and execute that file. So it will run the create and insert commands. So if you click on File and Open File once you're connected, and you just browse to that SQL script, that SQL Azure, MVC Music Store create.sql, open that up. And it opens it in the query window. So all I need to do to build my tables is just click the execute button once. It won't run quite as quickly connecting to Azure as it did, when I ran it on my local server. Still not a very big script, shouldn't take too long. So my query's done. I have a little green check mark. And now if down in my Object Explorer, I click this refresh button, we should now have 6 tables on Azure. Not all of them have data, but most of them do. I think order and order details are blank, but at least album, artist, and cart should be populated. So I'll just run a quick query on my album table and make sure the data's there. Which it is. You can see I've got 246 records in my album table. So I've got an exact replica of my local server and on Azure of the database. So you can work either server, whichever one you prefer is fine. It would be faster for me in class to use my local server. I probably will connect to the Azure server so that in a few weeks we'll deploy our web application to the Azure web server, and obviously it needs the live database in that case. It can't work online with a local database instance. Database has to be online. So even though it'll make things slightly slower for me, probably more scalable for me to work online that way. So we're basically done. We don't really need to do much more in here. We just needed to create that database in the Azure portal, connect to it here so that we could run this script. I'll just close this. I don't think there used to be in the Azure portal, they used to have a little query editor right in here, so you could actually write and run and execute queries within Azure. I think may have gotten rid of it. If they didn't, they've hidden it really well. Yeah. Don't think they really have that here. So we can't make a huge database, only 32 megs in the free tier they give us. So now let's look at how do we connect this up to our web application? And also how, if we're having trouble or we don't want to use Management Studio, how do we actually connect directly to the database straight in Visual Studio? Like I said, I find it slow, but I'll show you how to do it. Some of you may prefer that. So let's open up Visual Studio. And I'm going to open up last week's project. So again, feel free to just use the one from GitHub. Not a problem. So I'm going to open up, it appears right here in my list of recent projects. So this is the one we set up last week. So it's loading 2 projects, both the web application as well as the unit testing project. Get loaded. So here was the last file we worked on. This was our layout file that includes our header and footer. We made a few changes to this file last week. I think the last thing we did was added this new services link. We built the services page. We added a link to it in our navigation bar. Now, if I want to get this site launched in my browser, how do I do it? We first open up our solution. We want to get it running. Yeah, we could go to the play button. I would recommend we go to the debug menu and choose without debugging instead. What's the difference? Not exactly. You're not too far off. Both of them are going to start the server. When do we start with debugging versus starting without debugging? Probably 9 times out of 10, we're going to want to start without debugging. If I use the debugger, we do this when we want to actually inspect parts of our code one line at a time with a breakpoint, which might be for trying to solve an error. The problem is if we do that, we can't make changes to the code while the server is running. We then find a problem and want to fix it or make a change. We have to press stop, we got to debug, and then we have to press start again. If we choose debugging, this will launch our application, but the debugger's not active, which means we can continue to make changes to it. Oh, right, I had to fix this morning. You won't get this error. This is because between last week's class and this week's class, I had both Visual Studio 2015 and 2017 on my computer. I'm running out of space because even though this is quite a good computer, the college gave us hard drives, which are 250 gigs only. And I had to update my Visual Studio components, install another 16 gigs. I had no space. So I uninstalled Visual Studio 2015, which now gave me this, which took me 15 minutes in this morning's class to fix. I can easily fix it now. I just need to update one of my project references. I'll just add that reference. My error is going to go away. So I added a reference to it, another DLL in the Microsoft library. I need to recompile my site, and my site should load now. This won't affect you unless you've also uninstalled an earlier version of Visual Studio between last week's class and this week's class. So after a build, notice that first page request is slow because the server caches that DLL code. So here is our application. Last week, we built this services page and added this link to the nav bar. That was kind of the last thing we did at the end of class. Everything else is exactly the same as we left it last week. So now we want to connect to our database through Visual Studio. So over here, you may see this window, or you may not. If you don't, I'll show you how to get it. I'm going to use this window called the Server Explorer. If I click on it, it gives me this little pop-out. If you don't see the Server Explorer, you just have to click on your View menu, and Server Explorer is the third item there. So just click on View Server Explorer, and it'll pop up this window for you. So what we want to do is we want to add a connection to our existing Azure database that we just built and populated. So if I select the data connections, right-click it, we're going to add a connection. We're not creating a new database, we're connecting to an existing database. Once again, our little file with all our credentials is handy because we need them again here. So under server name, we need to grab that. You don't want to click this little drop down if you can avoid it. It tends to hang Visual Studio. So just paste it in without clicking the arrow if you can. Ah, sorry. You probably had one window pop up before this, didn't you? I'll explain why you got that window and I didn't. You got this window first probably when you click Add Data Connection, right? So this window is asking what kind of database are we connecting to? So make sure you pick the third option, which says Microsoft SQL Server. The reason I didn't get this window popping up, but probably some of you did, I did this morning in class, and I checked this box that says always use this selection. So it skips this next time, which is fine. We're not going to connect to any other kind of database besides Microsoft SQL Server. So it's fine if you check always use this option. So pick SQL Server, and we get this. Then you get the login screen. So copy and paste your server name in. Change your authentication method from Windows to SQL Server. Type in your password. Make sure you check Save My Password. So it will save that credential and you don't need to re-enter it. Once you've put this in, if you then, that enables this drop-down list that says select or enter database name. So once you select it, it tries to connect to the server with your credential, and you should see master as well as the database you created. So pick your database name, don't pick master. That's just a system database that we can't modify. So your screen should look like mine now with all of your credentials. Click the test connection button down at the bottom left. Rick, I assume the application you're using has something similar to this, but I really don't know. Right, we're in Visual Studio. We're not in Management Studio. So it should tell you your connection is okay, and then just click OK. So, sorry? To use which program? So we can actually see the database here. Notice I'm connected now. And if I expand, I can see my tables. I can show the table data. So some of the simple things that I could do within Management Studio, I can do here in Visual Studio. Notice how slow it is. It's much slower. So I'm just trying to look at my album table and see the data. When I ran the same query in Management Studio, it ran much faster. So this is why I generally don't use the Server Explorer for querying and managing my database. I use it to connect to the database, but that's about it. Wow, it's really slow. Not usually this bad. There's my query result. So I could use this window, but like I said, I find it's just too slow. So there is one really useful thing about using the Server Explorer, however. We can use this, and it's going to help us set up our database connection in our web code, and we're not going to really have to write any code to do this. So in your web project, if you scroll down to the bottom, not to the test project, but we have this file here. It's the very last file underneath of startup.cs called web.config. This is our application configuration file Visual Studio builds. So it's between startup.cs and my test project. So if you open up this file, just double click it. There's a section here starting on line 11 that Visual Studio automatically generated for us that holds any database connection strings. And there's one already in here. It's got three properties. It has a name property, which is set as default connection. It's got a provider name, meaning what type of database it is. It's an SQL Server database, so the provider's name is SQL Client. And the connection string, if we look, it actually is using a local database that was created last week on Friday the 26th at this time, and it gives it an MDF extension. So you don't actually even need a local database server. It just builds it as a data file. The problem is we really have no way to look or change that database. So we don't want to work with this database. We want to work with our Azure database instead. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to wipe out the rest of the stuff in here I need. I want my connection string called default connection. I'll explain why in a minute. And I want that provider name to be the same. Everything in here, everything inside the connection string, I'm going to delete all this. Everything except my double quotes. So it now looks like this. So we're keeping the name, we're keeping the provider name, but we're going to change the connection string to use our Azure database instead. Now here's the reason why we're going to keep this name default connection. Probably going to have to repeat this a few times. It doesn't really matter for the first month or two of class, but in a few weeks, we're going to add authentication to this project. We set up our project last week. You might remember we changed it from no authentication to individual user accounts. And when we did that, Visual Studio gave us a huge security infrastructure that I'm recommending, Rick, you don't want to recreate, right? We have files, we have controllers, we have views, we had references. That entire infrastructure looks for a database connection called default connection. So we could change this and it will work for today, but once we try and register and log in, it isn't going to work anymore if we name our connection string something else. Every time I teach this class, I get assignments submitted to me where the web part worked, the website works, but I can't register and log in. And the very first thing I do is go to the web.config and I check and see if the student used a different name for the connection string. And virtually every time, that's the problem. The code they had was right, but they didn't have a connection string called default connection, so the Microsoft security libraries don't work, and you can't register or log in. So never change this, just leave it. So the connection string that we've wiped out, here's how we get it. I'll show you a couple ways to get it. So easiest way, I go to my Server Explorer, I click on my database, and down here in the Properties window, it now shows me the properties of my connection, and the third property here says connection string. If you don't see this little window that says Properties, you can just click on your View menu, choose Properties window, and it'll pop up. So if I just put my cursor into the connection string, double click, it'll highlight the whole connection string, although it does hide the password. I can drag this over and make this a little bigger if it's hard for you to see. So grab that connection string value, double click, choose copy. Now you can also get the connection string from the Azure portal. I'll show you where to get it from there as well. It's another option. So all I'm going to do is put my cursor in here, paste it in, save the file. So now our web application can use this connection string called default connection. We can also find this connection string in the Azure portal here. So if we just go to our database, on the main database overview page, there's a section here that says connection strings, show database connection strings. So I'll just click that. Here's our ASP.NET connection string. Obviously, there's placeholders for the credential, so you can simply copy that, paste it into your connection string attribute in web.config, enter your credentials, you're good to go.
Yeah, right.
Yes, you will have to replace the password value. So we saved that, and now our application can connect and access our database. We haven't called it yet, but it's all set up for when we do. We'll call it, we'll use this in a couple of weeks, but at least we've got it set up now. We don't have to go through the setup later. I'm just going to save that. And I think this is probably a good time for us to take a break. Going for a while. So let's take 20 minutes here. Okay, we'll come back around 20 to Then we got 70 minutes. So when we come back, we're going to make a new controller, create a few views, and play around with that. We're not going to work with any real data today. We'll just kind of mock up a little bit of pretend data and work with that. Okay, so I'm going to stop the video stream. We'll come back in 20 minutes.